do have a confession I have to make. I do not like disruption. I don't like uncertainty. I do not appreciate the radical flexibility that is sometimes asked of me. I don't care for it one bit. And maybe that's your story too. Just being able to go with the flow. It's not really your bag. It's not my bag either. You want to kind of know it's A, then B, then C, then D, and we're going to have predictable outcome and a controllable process, and everything's just going to be peachy. That's the way I wish the world operated, but we all know that's not really the way that the world operates. Disruption and uncertainty, change that is unwelcome or uninvited just sometimes comes our way. And we can either be bitter or we can be better. We can trust or we can be frustrated. But that's just the way that life is for all of us. But I'll tell you that it's that disruption, that uncertainty. When I see those things coming, that is by definition a bad day for me. That's what makes for a bad day. And I really wish that there was some kind of warning system present in life that could tell you, hey, next Tuesday is going to be rough. Buckle up, hang on. It's going to be hard to handle. I wish that there was some way of knowing that you're about to step into a difficult season. So I did what every curious person does. I turned to Google. And I found a list of things that can tell you that you're about to have a bad day. You're going to have a bad day when you wake up face down on the sidewalk. Okay? That's going to be a bad day. You're leaving for work, and then all of a sudden you're like waking up, your nose is on the pavement, and you just, how'd I get here? It's going to be a bad day. You wake up, you turn on the morning news, and on the television there are escape routes out of Atlanta. It's going to be a bad day when that happens. You get up, sit down to breakfast at your breakfast table in that beautiful nook with the windows, and the bird on the branch by the window is a vulture. Right? That's a sign. Going to be a bad day. It's going to be a bad day when your horn gets stuck when you're following a pack of motorcycles on 285. Bad day. Bad day. You get to work and there's a Fox 5 news team in your office. Bad day. Your child wakes you up and gets you out of bed with questions about how exactly to flush a grapefruit down the toilet. Bad day. You wake up to discover that your waterbed broke. And then you remember that you don't have a waterbed. Bad day. You know it's going to be a bad day when the city sewer line backs up and floods your house on Christmas morning. Ask me how I know. It would be nice if we could get some warning before the roller coaster that is life begins to take us on a downhill swing. It would be great if we could have a heads up, but we don't get a heads up. We just find ourselves sometimes riding that roller coaster, and the descent can be rapid and the uphill climb can be slow and tedious. That's just the way life is. It can be a roller coaster. Now, don't get me wrong. There are great parts of every life. Don't you agree? There are parts of everybody's life that are happy, that are good, that are joyful, where we feel and believe we are blessed. But along with happiness comes headache and heartache. And it seems that those three things are the stuff that life is made of: happiness, headaches, and heartaches. It's kind of a pretty even mix of all three. That's the stuff that life is made of. Pain comes to us in a variety of shapes and sizes. There's a mighty big difference between losing your job and the cat throwing up in your shoe. That's two very different experiences. Losing your job rearranges your life. The cat puking in your shoe, well, that's just kind of an annoyance that you can take care of. It's no fun and nobody likes it, but it doesn't ruin things for you. It's one thing to stub your toe on the coffee table. It's another thing to have to plan a funeral for your spouse. One hurts a little, the other's devastating. Pain comes to us in a variety of forms, but the one common thing is that no matter the form, no matter the size, no matter the shape, pain is unwelcome. We never want to see pain coming, whether it's really big or kind of small, whether it's devastating or just an annoyance. We don't want pain. We don't want stress. We don't want suffering and the struggle to come our way. You know, it's kind of interesting to me that until recently in human history, our ancestors generally assumed that life was going to be hard. They did not have an expectation to live endlessly happy lives. They assumed that life was going to be hard, that there were going to be hurts, that there were going to be tears, that there was going to be pain, that was normal. It was to be expected. And it's only in recent times that we as a species have begun to generally form the expectation that bad things are not normal, that bad things should not happen, that we should not hurt, that we should be just pretty much happy all the time. We should be fairly comfortable all the time. And the things that hurt us, they just don't belong. I mean, somehow the universe has gotten mixed up when those bad things happen. And sometimes we even put it in the context of faith, and people ask questions like, if there is an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God, then how could such a God let this thing happen to me? Now, I don't blame anybody for asking those questions, because I've asked those questions. I've had experiences where life was hurting and I felt like a little child yanking on his daddy's pants leg saying, "Daddy, why? Why? Why did this thing happen to me? It hurts, Papa. It hurts. Would you please make it stop?" And in those moments, I cannot tell you if what I was feeling was childlike or childish. I can't tell you which it was, but it was this sub-rational feeling that just bypassed rational analysis. It bypassed my intellect, my ability to observe and come to understand. It was just raw emotion. Daddy, why? This hurts. So I understand that gut level emotional feeling when you have to face something that causes you pain. But I have to admit, on the other hand, I find that perspective to be a little bit puzzling, because God never promised a pain-free life. Never. I mean, the scripture are full of promises of God's faithfulness, of God's strength, of God's purpose, but never in there is a promise that life's going to be pain-free. On the contrary, Jesus warned us up front, hey, heads up, buckle up, buttercup. Life's gonna bring trouble. You're gonna have trouble. You're gonna have hard times. You're gonna know stress. You're gonna know pain. You're gonna know what it's like to worry. You're gonna know grief. You're going to have trouble in the world. So heads up. Don't let it catch you by surprise. And of course, he made the most important promise after that warning: I've overcome the world, and I will be with you always. But we still carry this expectation that somehow something is wrong when we're hurting. Now, the Apostle Paul, he knew a thing or two about suffering. Paul lived a very hard life. Paul lived a life that would put a great many sufferers to shame. Through the little biographical passages in the New Testament, you can see Paul sort of talking about his difficult experiences. He was imprisoned multiple times. And sometimes in prison, he was tortured. He was whipped. He says 5 times, 39 lashes. You know why 39? Interesting little tidbit of history. Because the Jewish law said the max was 40. So they would do 39 in case they miscounted. 5 times he was whipped, 39 lashes. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was pounded with stones and left for dead. In fact, there were people who were so eager to see Paul wiped out that you can read about an episode in Acts 23 where 40 men made an oath with each other that they would not eat or drink until they had managed to catch and kill Paul. Friends, that's stressful. I mean, that makes stubbing your toe seem like, a birthday party. I mean, that's really, really stressful. Paul was shipwrecked 3 times. He was afloat on the sea for a night and a day. When he made it to land, he was bitten by snakes. He often had to go without food for days. He sometimes had to go without sleep or sleep on the ground or out in the weather. Paul was persecuted, criticized, threatened. He had to fight against people who wanted to twist his message, to alter the gospel. And that caused Paul more worry than anything else because he was worried about the churches that he had planted getting off track and going off the rails. Paul had a stressful life. It was not an easy road. But Paul's perspective on his suffering was not that he was being treated unfairly. Paul's perspective was not that God had let him down. We read a little bit about Paul's perspective in 2 Corinthians 4. We're going to start in verse 7. 2 Corinthians 4:7. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. And what is the treasure? The treasure, of course, is the gospel itself, the gift of God's grace, the good news that forgiveness is real, that mercy is available, that reconciliation with God and with one another is a possibility. It's not impossible. These things are not out of reach. You and I can have the life that we were created to live because of God's gift of grace. That's the treasure. Now, what are the jars of clay? Well, those are God's messengers. Jars, what do? They contain, they hold, and they deliver something so that it can be shared and made use of. The jars contain that treasure, so the treasure can be held and then given away. Jars are useful. Jars have a purpose. But here's the thing. Jars are fragile. Jars are easily damaged. Jars are easily broken. And they're rarely perfect. You know, once in a while, I like to be Captain Obvious. In the ancient world, they did not make jars of clay in factories. They made jars of clay by hand. So they were rarely perfect. They might have been a little misshapen, a little out of balance, not completely round. Might even been a little lumpy. Is anybody in touch with lumpy? They might even be cracked. And friends, you and I are those jars of clay. That's us, that's me, that's you. Yes, I just called you cracked pots. We are fragile vessels that carry a life-changing truth. Now, what is the power that Paul talks about? It's God's all-surpassing power. I love the way that Paul says that. God's all-surpassing power. It's not God's somewhat sufficient power. It's not God's availability on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's God's all-surpassing power to meet whatever need and whatever challenges there are in our lives. Now, this is a theme that Paul comes to over and over and over again in the New Testament, that our weakness is a place for God's strength to be on display. Our frailty is a place where God's power can show up. It's not about us, Paul said. It's about the all-surpassing power of God, the power of the gospel to forgive sin, to heal spiritual wounds, to restore relationships, to deliver us from bondage. That's God's power, not our power. It's about God. It's not about us. It's about what Jesus can do. It's not about what we can do. And Paul goes on in verse 8, and you probably have heard this many times. It's a great word to remember. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. Powerful words there, Brother Paul. Powerful words. The life of Jesus, friends, overcame the death of Jesus. There was Good Friday, and then there was Easter Sunday. There was a cross, and the grief that ensued. And there was an empty tomb that gave birth to vitality, life, joy, and eternal hope. And Paul was saying, yes, Jesus endured suffering and insults and pain and eventually death, but that was not the end of his story. We too experience insults and injury and pain and suffering, but neither two do those things have the last word in our lives. Our life is a vessel in which God lives for the purpose of sharing the hope of the gospel with the world. Friends, if it was all about us, life would be exactly like it is right now, with one big difference. We would be hard pressed on every side and crushed. We would be perplexed and in despair. We would be persecuted and abandoned. We would be struck down and destroyed. But it's God's power that sustains us when we're perplexed and crushed and pressed down and all of that stuff. It's about the power of God within us by grace, to where we are not abandoned, we are not destroyed, we are not in despair. It's not over. It's not the end of the book. Paul said in verse 16, therefore, we do not lose heart. Whenever the Apostle Paul uses the word therefore, that's a big flag that says pay attention. In fact, you may want to back up a few verses and read it again. Paul uses therefore to make very big points. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Because in the midst of the things that hurt, in the midst of the things that cause pain, we are not ultimately defeated. God's purposes have not been hindered. God is still God, and we are still the children of God. We don't lose heart because of all that God has done. We don't lose heart because of all that God has promised to do. We can find all those things in the stories of our spiritual ancestors. We can find those things in the testimony of our believing friends as we see what God is up to in the lives of people around us. We can see those things in our own story if we just look back and see all the times and all the ways that God showed up, that we didn't really see it at the time, but we can see it looking back. God is faithful, and Easter Sunday always follows Good Friday. Then he goes on in verse 16, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Friends, one of the hard truths of me and you is that we are running headlong, full speed ahead into mortality. Every one of us, no matter if we're at the height of our strength, if we're at the height of our intellect, if we're at the height of our power and influence, every one of us is running towards mortality. Every one of us is day by day, moment by moment, fading away, wasting away, gradually losing strength, gradually losing power, gradually losing our ability to influence the world around us. It's just the nature of the outer man, the outer woman, the outer person. This thing that we wear is wearing out. It's unavoidable. Yes, take care of this suit, but it's not going to last forever. And what Paul is saying is that even as our body is wasting away, our spirit is gaining strength. Our spirit is growing in life and in joy and in hope. God's work, friends, is to create and then recreate, to constantly renew, to make new day by day, morning after morning, to bring water to the desert, to bring new life to a dead forest. And then Paul goes on to say, and here's how it works. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Oh, I love that phrase, light and momentary. Light and momentary. Light and momentary. Paul is not saying that our problems are trivial. Paul is not saying that our problems don't matter. What Paul is saying is there's another perspective on your problems. Because if you look at your problems from God's perspective, through the lens of what God is up to in the world and in your life, by comparison, by the mass and the weight and the immense majesty of God's eternal glory, all that other stuff is light and momentary. It's not that God doesn't care. On the contrary, the scripture testifies God cares about what you care about. God cares about what hurts you. God cares about what causes you tears. God's not uncaring. God's not unkind. God is full of compassion. Compassion was God's idea. Everybody else is just a mediocre copy. Compassion is what God brings to our suffering. But Paul is calling us to a perspective. And one of the ways that I've heard that perspective expressed is that God's goal is not to make you happy. God's goal is to make you his. Max Lucado. Such a great way to put it. God's goal is not to make you happy, but God's goal is to make you his. And Paul is pointing us toward the fact that God is working redemptively in all of the junk, in all of the baggage, in all of the hard days and difficult season, in the midst of the tears that you shed. God is at work to bring redemption for your good. God is not interested in causing pain. God is interested in coming to pain and saying, watch what I can do. Watch the new life that I can bring to pass. Neither God nor Paul is saying, hey, don't worry about it, life's easy. What Paul is saying, what God is saying through Paul, is that from a kingdom perspective, all that stuff is just light and momentary. I was talking with my dad this week, and he reminded me of another preacher quote, one of his favorite from somebody that had been significant in his life. And that quote was simply this: gaze upon God, glance at all that other stuff. I love that. Gaze upon God, glance at all that other stuff. I told him I was going to use it in a sermon. Bang, here I did. And that's what Paul is trying to say. It's not that our problems don't matter. It's just they don't matter ultimately. Don't fixate on your problems. Focus on God's faithfulness. Yeah, you got to pay a little attention to these things. But they are not the end of your story. They are not the sum of what your life is about. What your life is about is the grace and presence and power of God in you and through you. That's what your life is about. So gaze at that, focus on that, put all your energy and attention there, and give as little attention to all this other stuff as you can. Gaze upon God and glance at all that other stuff. And that's exactly what Paul is saying. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Now, some will call that being so heavenly minded that we are no earthly good. Maybe so. But better than being so earthly minded that we are no heavenly good. Paul calls us to look beyond what we can appropriate through our senses of sight and sound and scent and taste and touch. He calls us to realize that the greater realities are above and beyond the things that we can feel and see right in front of us. These things are real. They're not fake. They're not imaginary, but they're not ultimately real, and they are fading away just like we are. All of the stuff that we worry about is wasting away and coming to nothing. But God's presence, God's purpose, God's power, that is eternal and unchanging and unfailing. Gaze upon God and glance at all that other stuff. Friends, I have absolutely no idea what most of you are going through. I know some, for some of you, but I don't know everything about any of you. But I know that God knows what you're going through. I know that God knows your worries. I know that God knows the things that keep you awake in the middle of the night. I know that God knows the things that tug at your heart and give you heartburn. And I believe with all my heart that God is inviting me and that God is inviting you in any and every season that comes along that is disruption and uncertainty, where you're asked to set aside the things you planned on and the things that you hoped for. I believe with all my heart that God is calling us. Turn to me. Turn to me. Focus on me. Build your heart on me. Find your purpose in me. Find your identity in me. That's the message of God to you and to me. So gaze upon God. Glance at all that other stuff. Fix your eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Don't give all your energy to what is temporary. Make it your priority that is unwavering, the things that are eternal. May the grace of God meet you at that deepest place that you need this very day.